Welcome back to another APUS History video lecture series. In this case, we're going to be taking a look at the New Deal. So the New Deal, the big question is whether or not it is an evolution of government or a total revolution in which America was operating in a way that it had not operated before. In order to understand this, let's put some context onto this. You might remember in the late 1800s, the overall philosophy was laissez-faire, meaning that the government should stay out of the economy, keep its hands off of the economy. What a lot of radicals argued at that time is that that's a total illusion. Government was always involved with the economy. And that led up to the progressives from 1900 to 1920. The progressives really argued the government has to get involved to break down monopolies and protect workers. So once we hit the 1920s, we have a series of what we would consider to be typically laissez-faire presidents. They included Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. Calvin Coolidge actually called this time period a return to normalcy. But then in 1928, we have a crash of the stock market, and it really raises the question, whose fault was this? Was it the Federal Reserve raising interest rates? The fall of real wages? Growing debt? Consolidation of markets? And then from 1920 to 1932, the economy takes a tailspin into not a recession, but a Great Depression. And there were some attempts to solve this through the government. There was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which gave out loans. There was a Hoover Dam public works project. But really throughout this time, what generally got considered was what people called Hoovervilles, which is sort of a derogatory term for homeless shelter areas, in which people who couldn't find homes would just be living out because of the huge amount of 25% unemployment. So in 1932, a new president comes into office, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he comes in with this idea of a New Deal. Now, what my thesis is going to be this time around is that this is in many ways evolution. It's evolution in the sense of where we've been moving now since the progressive age, but it's also a revolutionary way of doing government. The mindset from here on out is that the government really needed to be there as a social safety net to protect people who had been harmed by the economy, but also to get involved in order to boost overall consumerism. Okay, so in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt initiated the first New Deal, and it was initiated under the ideas of relief, recovery, and reform. So what about relief? Relief is best symbolized through a series of what are called the alphabet programs, and that's because they all had these alphabetical names to them. For example, the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. The CCC hired young men to do basically anything, to just go out and rake leaves if possible. Why? Well, number one, it gave these young men a sense of purpose and confidence, but number two, it paid them. So that way they had money to go out and consume on things. Another idea was through recovery, to kind of fix the problems of the past. A good example of this was the bank holiday. Banks were shut down for 100 days, and during that time, people had a chance to kind of relax after all of their fears of what was going on with the bank. The government also took on what was called the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The idea was to insure people's money up to a certain point so that they would feel more trust in putting their money back into the banks. Also, there was the Glass-Steagall Act. The idea of the Glass-Steagall Act was to create a firewall between what are called commercial versus investment banks. One of the problems leading up to the Great Depression, and also happened in 2008, was banks consolidated, and people really didn't know when they made investments with their banks how dangerous those investments could be. Well, at the same time, there were certain long-term recovery plans that were made as well. For example, the best example of this is the NRA or NIRA, and no, this is not the gun organization. The NRA or the NIRA allowed for central planning. Not so much with the government, but amongst businesses. So businesses would get together in like cartels and form some basic quotas, increase their minimum wage, decide how many people they were going to hire, and so forth. Why were they doing this? The main problem in the economy seemed to be overproduction. The idea being that they had produced too much, there wasn't enough consumerism. So the idea was to lower production, but increase wages. Kind of think of it as like a floor and a ceiling meeting together. If you lower production, but you increase wages, you get more people to buy things. This should keep the economy going. Problem was, a lot of this didn't really work out all that well economically. And then on top of that, the Supreme Court eventually called this unconstitutional. Another attempt at this time period to get the economy going was the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority. This provided electricity to rural areas, but it also provided for a public works program. They created a massive dam in the Tennessee Valley area in order to provide more electricity. Now, this raised a big issue. Did the federal government under the Constitution have a right to come in and deal with electricity issues? Or was that really a state role? Well, remember, electricity wasn't around during the time of the Founding Fathers. So nowhere in the Constitution are you going to find whether or not the federal government has a role to do this. The question comes up, is this something we should do anyways, considering that we have changed over the last 200 years? So, in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt runs for office. He wins a second term. And then right after that, there's what's called the Roosevelt Recession. What's that? Within the Great Depression, the economy took a huge hit. And so there's sort of a recession within a depression. But what caused this? Well, conservative critics would say it was because there was too much government intervention. Businesses were too dependent on government. Other people would claim no, his conservatives in his administration called him to decrease government spending. That's what threw us into a tailspin. So now we get into the second New Deal. In the second New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt decides to become more aggressive. For example, back in the early 1930s, farmers had been overproducing on their land. And all of a sudden, these windstorms started to kick up in the Midwest. And when they did, they kicked up a huge amount of dust and created what was called the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was one of the most disastrous things that could have happened to farming at the time, just because not only was it disastrous in the way it looked, but on top of that, it basically destroyed the topsoil of farming. So the question was how to reduce overproduction. Franklin Roosevelt passed the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The idea behind it was to destroy crops and kill livestock. The purpose really was to lower overproduction, but you can imagine in the midst of a Great Depression, this didn't look all so hot. Here you have all these people who are starving and we're destroying the very thing that could be feeding them. So the Supreme Court basically knocked down the AAA. Well, Franklin Roosevelt pursued it again with the second AAA, and in this particular case, instead of destroying things, what he called for was that the federal government would provide subsidies to farmers. Basically, we would provide money to farmers not to farm. So by doing that, farmers would be able to get money, but on top of it, they would be getting money for the areas that they weren't farming in. The purpose of doing this was to lower production rates and raise prices. Why would you want to raise prices on farm goods in the middle of the Depression? Because it would bring in more money for farmers. The National Labor Relations Board was created at this time. It protected unions, and it would also eventually mandate that children stay in schools right after World War II. Social Security was created at this time. This was an idea co-opted from a socialist named Dr. Townsend. Dr. Townsend actually said all elderly people should be given $500 per year. Well, that was not adopted, but a similar idea would be adopted. The idea of Social Security is that people throughout their lives work and contribute to a basically national insurance program that at a certain age they would then be able to take that money out. The hope of this was that this would decrease elderly poverty within the country. Now, all of these things that were being done created pretty massive controversies. Some of the controversies are not as important long-term, but they're important for mentioning. For example, in Chicago, there was a radio host named Father Coughlin. Father Coughlin was anti-Semitic, basically made the argument that the New Deal was basically a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. Another example on the opposite end was Huey Long. Huey Long said basically Franklin Roosevelt hadn't gone far enough. He called for what he called a chicken in every man's pot, the idea of socialism, that we would redistribute the wealth out and create more equality within the country. Well, the truth is that's not really the long-term controversy. The long-term controversy of the New Deal is going to be on the structure and role of government. Should the government be interventionist or should it be laissez-faire? We're still arguing that today. Probably one of the biggest cases, though, of controversy is Roosevelt's court-packing plan. So time and time again, Roosevelt's plans were being stopped by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court at this time period ran on what was known as natural law philosophy. This comes from the late 1800s. The philosophy was that laws should be interpreted through natural rights and natural law. And the idea of natural law was that the business cycle was natural, that people's property rights were natural, and so therefore you couldn't go beyond that. Well, a new school of thought had risen at this time period in judicial circles called critical realism, which said that laws basically are interpreted by our values, and we need to interpret laws by the context of our time period. Here we are in a Great Depression. The main purpose of law is to serve the community, not to just be a law in and of itself. So we ought to interpret those laws in a way that protect rights, yes, but also protects the community. So Roosevelt eventually said that the court had just gotten too old and it was not willing to change. And so he began arguing that there should be a court justice added for every justice above the age of 70. Well, you can imagine this led to massive criticism, both from his supporters and his critics. They said this completely violated separation of powers. In the end, in 1937, the conservative justices just basically started to allow a lot of Franklin Roosevelt's decisions to stand anyways. But it did bring up a criticism of whether or not Franklin Roosevelt was overstepping his powers. Okay, what are our takeaways? Well, we should look at an evaluation of the New Deal. Did it actually work? Here are some of its pros. Unemployment fell from 25% to 9%. There was a newfound confidence in America. And the New Deal and all its programs led to new forms of art, public works, and electrification for businesses and farmers. What are its cons? Well, so unemployment did fall to 9%, but it never fell below that. In fact, it took until World War II for unemployment to really fall. Another problem is that the federal government expanded dramatically, and depending upon your point of view, that could be something you could see as pretty negative. Many of the programs did have temporary harms to communities. For example, take the second AAA. In order to get the AAA subsidies, you really had to have a lot of land. Well, who are the people who didn't have a lot of land? It tended to be African American farmers. And so actually African Americans suffered a good deal under the second AAA. The South also at this time period demanded and won exclusion of black people from a lot of programs. So take Social Security. You won't find anywhere in Social Security an actual racist claim to exclude black people. But what it did do was it said certain jobs would not be included. For example, janitors. Well, in the South, who tended to be kind of segregated into those jobs? African Americans. So in many ways, Franklin Roosevelt's programs kind of gave a head nod to the South in order to gain their consent to having these programs. Okay, I'll see you guys in class.